Yo, what is up, guys? Snap here. Today we're going to be talking all about last Epoch and all of the multiplayer builds we're going to be playing in the 1.2 Tombs of the Erased expansion here. We have a lot of builds, a lot of stuff to go over here, so let's jump right into it. First things first, we're going to be playing mainly 2 supports and 2 carries in our 4-man group comp. So first, let's go over the 2 supports we're going to be playing, everything that they provide, and some changes that we've had to make as a result of the removal of Volatile Reversal. Now, first things first is just going to be a standard cookie cutter Healing Hands Paladin. The reason this is so strong is these nodes in Healing Hands right here that give you ward per 10% increased healing effectiveness. This gives you a bunch of ward to all your teammates. It's the main thing we're building around here. Now, one of the main things you're doing on this build is you're grabbing the Healing Hands channeling node to make sure that you have a 4 cast per second that's consistent. It does up the mana cost a little bit. This node is really good because it gives you a very quick 4 per second cast rate, and you can also take these nodes down here, which reduce your cast speed. It doesn't affect the cast rate because you have a consistent 4 channels per second. In order to make this node work, you have to have a drain mod equipped. That is either Last Steps of the Living, an Exsanguinous, or the experimental drain mod on your gloves. When you have this on and you have the Healing Hands with a bunch of healing effectiveness, you're going to be basically generating a shit ton of ward. So Healing Hands, of course, #1 priority in the build. You're just there to generate a shit ton of ward for all your allies. #2 skill is just going to be Holy Aura. Of course, it gives you a ton of crit multi, crit chance, gives you some penetration, poison resist, and the Ellie Risk does help your carries a lot in their res capping situation, so very good nodes to take here. Next up, we got Javelin. The main thing that this skill is doing here is you take this node battle standard. This is the only node that really matters on the tree here, and it will give you increased damage to your allies per attunement. This build racks up a ton of attunement, sitting at 173 top end, so that's 346% damage for your allies that are standing inside of the battle standard, so it's very, very good here. Next on the bar is just going to be Shield Throw. The main nodes we're after here is going to be these nodes which target your allies with Shield Throw. It gives them a buff, which gives them 300 armor, which is multiplied by your attunement, 6% effect per attunement. 6% effect multiplied by your 173 attunement is giving you 1,038 effect of that 300 armor buff, and this translates to 3,311 flat armor for all of your teammates, which is massive, of course. Rest of the tree here, just going to be grabbing some random utility stuff, giving it more ricochets. It also, heals you, steals armor, whatever. It's all just bullshit. Moving on to sigils. Now, the thing you have to know about sigils is that they reworked it so that it gives you the sigils passively and you no longer have to cast them. They also gave some increased sigil effect on the tree, which basically is just acting like aura effect if you're from PoE. The nodes here that are really good in sigil is going to be the increased damage here as well as the flat damage here. After that, you want to pick up the +1 sigil here, +1 sigil here, as well as the increased effect on the right side here. If you're unfamiliar, sigils are an aura. You cast them, it makes these rotating balls, and as long as you're walking around and your teammates, it'll grant them all of the buffs that are on the sigil tree. The important thing to know about sigils is that these buffs will stack among party members if different players are taking different nodes on the sigil tree. So 2 players with sigils can't have the same nodes and benefit from them twice, but if you click different nodes than different people, then you can also give those buffs to allies. Now, crucially, you can have 2 supports where one gives you fire damage and then one converts them to void, and you can benefit from the flat damage more than once. One of them just has to be converted to void. So the first support here is giving 3 fire damage per symbol here, plus the 3 implicit on the skill for 6 total fire damage times 5, which is 30. You multiply by 1.35 for the aura effect. Each support is giving around 40 flat damage, one of them being fire, the other one going to be void. That's all of the relevant skills and utility. We can talk about the personal itemization and gearing that you can do on this character here. We can go through it slot by slot. First off is the helmet. The best thing to do here is to get some crit mitigation. It's a very, very good place to get your crit mit, as well as a really, really high armor base. This Exalted Helmet's probably going to be better than any single unique that you can get, just for the amazing crit mitigation it has. T7 attunement where possible. Next most important mod is going to be your Healing Hands levels, and then increase health, and then, obviously more crit mit if you can get it here. Orion's Eye is going to be best in slot here, mainly for it's an Oracle base, and you want to take less damage over time. Aberoth has a ton of damage over time. Aberoth also does a lot of void damage, and so converting that void damage to fire, and then you take less fire damage, making you take less void damage, making you more tanky versus the pinnacle bosses in the game. This is probably a little bit hard to get with 2 LP, but if you give a 1 LP Orion's Eye, you can definitely just slam health onto it. Healing effectiveness is just a luxury here. As for the main hand, the Monument of Protection is going to be pretty mandatory here, as it's going to be very, very hard to block cap without it. Plus, there aren't very many attractive main hands that you can put on your build here, and so this just makes sense. The best slam here is to get Shred, because when you're channeling your Healing Hands, it's also going to be shredding the boss, applying a ton of armor shred. Very, very good. Chest piece is null portent. It's just a ton of DR. You don't really need much else on chest piece. You want to slam a 2-minute health here, of course. And this is just giving it extra 20% DR. Now, this is the new addition to the build. It's going to be the new shield, which is the Countenance of Majasa. This is going to be slammed with T7 block chance. Of course, healing effectiveness is a luxury. But the thing that's really crazy and broken about this particular shield is that the block effectiveness that you have is going to be applying to damage over time as if it had been blocked, but it doesn't actually require you to proc your block. It's just giving you this, percentage of your 75% block mitigation to all dots, which is another additional dot mitigation layer. Additionally, when you're mapping in monoliths, this petrify should be pretty crazy for just stunning trash and rares and, blue mobs just constantly if you have multiple people wearing this, which you have both supports running this. So I think in monos, the petrify is actually going to feel pretty good. And then obviously the 96% lower chance for bosses is probably going to make this pretty useless for any sort of bossing application. Next up, we have red rings with slammed attunement. This is pretty obvious here. You have a ton of attributes, so it's very easy to activate the red rings. This is just the R, gives you all of the resistances you need to make this build work for your null portent. It's very, very convenient here. So red rings with attunement, definitely the thing you want here. Alternatives early would be to wear the heirloom of the last nomad slammed with health. That gives you a very big health pool early on. Then later on, you can cut your health pool a little bit in exchange for more damage reduction later. Gloves is going to be Hands of Judgment. This basically just gives you a ton of attunement. That's what you're after here, is just big attunement rolls. And so Hands of Judgment here with 2, maybe 3 LP, the best thing to put on here. The mods in order of importance is, of course, block chance. You want to be block capped. You're perfectly at 100% in this planner. And then the next most important mod would be actually the Drain mod, so that you can activate your Healing Hands ward generation. If you don't have 3 LP, you have to drop the attunement here. Next up is for the mountain here. You're just wearing this strictly for the 12 all attributes. Obviously, you want to stack attunement. This gives you the most attributes. You probably want to have 2 pairs of these, one with movement speed and one without movement speed. I don't think with this particular build, you're so tanky, you don't need that much movement speed on the build. So putting another health affix here is probably beneficial, just so you have that much more tankiness. But if you're on monos, you want to have movement speed, you want to get to the objective faster. So having 2 pairs of these, one with movement speed, is probably preferred. And then last but not least, if you have a Shattered Worlds, you have LP on it, obviously you're equipping this, but obviously you're not going to have this early on. The alternative here is to put on a Knowledge of the Erased Sentinel and then getting healing effectiveness or Symbols of Hope levels onto it. It's going to be this item here with symbols slammed on. And then as for the belt here, it's just going to be Shattered Chains. The only reason you're wearing this is for the increased armor on the unique, and then you just have double health here. As for the idols, the undisputed best idols are going to be these 2x2s with block effectiveness and healing effectiveness. And then if you can Weaver roll a last mod, less damage taken over time while using a shield is going to be the best bang for your buck here. This is also giving you like 130 health on block, which is, not the worst. It's just a little bit of extra recovery layer you have there. As for blessings, it's basically health regen, block chance, block effect, armor, and all res, just a bunch of defensive blessings here. This character is obviously a brick with all of its DR layers. It has DR on the tree, of course. It has DR on the chest, has DR on the rings, has DR on the amulet. It has block cap with high block mitigation. It has basically everything going for it. So that makes this character a prime candidate to host your monoliths, especially if you're pushing higher corruption. If you're unaware, in party, if the host dies, you will no longer gain stability towards that boss. So it's very imperative that the host who's hosting your monoliths is not dying. So you generally want to make it the tankiest person in the party, and this one is it. I guarantee you no other character is going to reach this level of tankiness and recovery. So this is what you want to be having host your monoliths. Lastly, quickly going over the passive tree, you're just clicking health and or healing effectiveness and or DR and block and attunement. Those are kind of the things that you're clicking on the passive tree. It's pretty cookie cutter. You're just grabbing health here. You're grabbing attunement all over the passive tree. One thing to mention is that this holy symbol node was changed on the patch and is now buffed. Whenever you block something, you're going to be giving your allies and yourself 30 ward per second scaled by your healing effectiveness. And since you're stacking so much healing effectiveness and attunement, you have around 2000% healing effectiveness on an endgame build. This is going to be giving you 600 ward per second just for blocking stuff on top of all of the healing hands, healing, and ward generation you're giving. So this is a big buff to this particular support build. The rest of the tree, just grabbing attunement, and then also grab the attunement here and the increased holy aura and symbol of hope effect at the end. That's like the big things here on the tree. That's about it for the healing hands paladin. Now we do have a new support here in the mix, which is going to be a cleanser paladin. Now, if you've seen anything from the actual team, you will know how much they have been shilling one particular build, which is going to be Judgement Paladin. This build is a certified banger. It is going to be the build that dominates hardcore ladder and is going to be the thing that most people are playing. Now, the one thing about this build you have to understand is something about spell queuing in Last Epoch. Spell queuing in Last Epoch is simply where you hold down more than one button, for example, example, I have Vengeance and Judgment here. If I hold down both of them at the same time, there is an order in which the abilities are cast. If I simply just hold down Judgment here on the dummy, I'm going to run out of mana, of course. But if I hold down Vengeance and Judgment, whenever I run out of mana, my character will immediately cue the next ability, which is left to right, which is going to be Vengeance whenever I run out of mana here. So you see how as I'm holding them down, both of them are casting. The leftmost ability on your bar is going to be the one that takes priority. So the button you want to be casting the most needs to be on the left side of your bar here. And then your generator skill, whatever it is, in my case Vengeance, wants to be to the right of that skill. The reason this is important is because Judgment is a mana hungry skill, and so you need a generator skill that you can weave in between your attacks in order to generate you mana. The node here on the tree, which gives you mana on hit for basic skills like Reave, Vengeance, Smite, and Multi-Strike, is the primary generator that you're using here. Additionally, there's a mod here which is mana gained when you use Vengeance and hit at least one enemy. So you have a total of 27 mana gained when you hit something with Vengeance. So those are the basics of spell queuing, right? We basically just have a generator and a spender, and we hold both of them down so that one will weave in whenever I'm out of mana, because Vengeance is a free skill. Now, why is that good, or why is that important? Well, the main thing we want to do is take Judgment and remove the cooldown. Great, what does that accomplish? So whenever you attack with Judgment, you leave behind Consecrated Ground, which is this healing circle you see here. This heals you over time, obviously when you're standing in the circle. And the crazy thing about Judgment is that this healing circle will stack. You can place a bunch of them and they overlap, and they will all heal you, and they all stack the healing. So on a character that's built for attack speed and a decent amount of healing effectiveness, you can basically just spew out tons of giant healing circles that will heal you, which is obviously pretty crazy. On a top end build that is optimized for it, it's not uncommon for the max healing rate of Judgment stackers to hit like 30k, maybe even 40k recovery per second, which obviously, as long as you're not one shot, then you can basically tank and recover anything in the game. The other main thing that this character is doing besides stacking a bunch of Judgment pools with Consecrated Ground is it provides a cleanse. At the end of a Judgment cast, the Judgment will blow up and erupt here, and whenever that erupts, it will cleanse you. You can manipulate the duration of your Consecrated Ground with this node here. There's a sweet spot where you put maybe 1 or 2 points in there where you have enough overlapping circles, but they're blowing up, responsively so that you're cleansing yourself when you want it. The reason why the cleanse is so important is because Aberoth, the pinnacle boss, has a really annoying debuff which is called Aberoth's Frailty, or rather Frailty of Aberoth here. This is 5% less damage multiplied with other modifiers per stack that you have, and a lot of the stuff in the arena, like the void beams and the void pools, just all of the stuff that's hitting you in the arena has a high chance of hitting you with this Frailty debuff. And in a fight where you're taking a really long time to kill it, the arena is just filled with garbage, it makes it really annoying to deal damage on the boss fight, even if you're able to tank all of the stuff. So having a consistent cleanse in the party where you have the Judgment blowing up over and over again, cleansing everybody, is going to keep your stacks low and your DPS very high. The cleanse makes it so you can ignore a lot of the mechanics that Aberoth is doing, because you can now stand inside of his void beams and you can now stand inside of his void pools, meaning that you can completely invalidate those mechanics, which is the primary reason why a cleanser paladin is being brought into the party here. So the main stuff you're bringing on the tree here for the Judgment paladin here is just going to be grabbing the no cooldown nodes. You grab the Holy Cleanse Eruption nodes, those are mandatory here. The next most important ones are going to be grabbing this Holy War Deliverance buff. This gives you extra mana back, and then of course you want to make the mana cost as low as possible, so taking the mana efficiency down here is very important as well. There's extra utility on the tree that you're grabbing, which is coming in the form of extra AoE for the healing circles, as well as a free frenzy whenever you hit something. You can float the rest of the points and it just increased healing effectiveness for your Consecrated Ground, but the rest doesn't really matter here. As for the primary generator skill, you're going to be using Vengeance, because this skill after the rework is just fucking honestly broken. So first off, if you hit something with Vengeance, you get a Prepare to Riposte buff, and the next hit that you take is riposted and you take less damage. By default, it's 25% less damage for that next incoming hit, but you reduce the base effect to 18% to get an additional riposte here for 2 ripostes per hit that you're giving with the skill. Additionally, you get a bunch of attack speed, which is good because more attack speed equals more mana generation, which equals more healing with more Judgment and more cleanses. So attack speed is going to be a big focus on the build here. Additionally, it is a very good source of Void Shred if you're pairing this with an Erasing Strike or carry, so this node down here is very good as well. And then additionally, you have an extra 26% DR if you've hit something with Vengeance in the last 2 seconds. So we have 18% DR here with an additional 26% DR from this node. We have riposted hits cannot crit you, so you have crit immunity for stuff like bosses. And then you float your extra points onto frailty, obviously less damage for the boss, and then armor shred and armor shred effect at the end. So tons of utility is brought about by this skill. Next up is shield bash. You have an interrupt for bosses. There are some boss attacks in some particular timeline bosses that you can interrupt, which is very convenient. And there's not really a better skill to put on here, so you just have an interrupt for stuff like supercharged slam on Aberoth, and you have interrupt for other bosses that are doing like pizza stuff, and interrupting Orbis is very convenient. Next up is of course sigils. As I said in the prior support, the conversion node here allows you to benefit twice from the flat damage from this node here in the base. So having one support click the void conversion here lets you get a total of 80 flat damage from supports. The increased damage here does not stack, so you don't need any points here. You just unfortunately have to travel through it. The rest of your points is just grabbing +1 sigil here, +1 sigil here, and then the sigil effect on the right side here. As for the healing hands, you are still proccing this node, which is the ward per 10% increase healing effectiveness, but you have a lot less healing effectiveness than the actual healing hands main channeler does. And you are going to be proccing this with this node, which gives you a 100% chance to proc your healing hands on melee hit, and that goes for both your vengeance and your judgment. And since you have a high amount of attack speed, you're probably just going to be just under the 4 casts per second that a channeler gets. To fill out the rest of the points with just all the increased healing effectiveness and the upfront healing, you grab the AoE and the mana cost because you want to keep the mana cost low because this build is very mana hungry. And then last, you want to take the less void damage taken for hitting your allies with healing hands. This synergizes super well with something like a Void Knight where they're converting a lot of their damage taken to void. And then obviously if you're fighting Aberoth, tons of his abilities are doing just void damage, so very, very good for bossing as well. You can see a lot of his abilities here are half void, half fizz, so void res, void, less void damage taken, very, very good for this boss. As for the gearing for the Judgement Paladin support here, it's going to be very, very similar to the healing hands guy, but you want to have some more investment in attack speed. So main thing, your helmet, obviously best place to get crit mitigation here. You want to get increased health for yourself. Personal defenses are necessary on this build because if you want to have high uptime on your Judgement, it means you need to be melee hitting the boss, so being able to just face tank everything in the game, very, very important. So the personal defense pool on this character is very, 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 very important. Oracle Amulet just for the less damage taken over time, health, double health rolls, and then healing effectiveness for your Judgement here is basically all you want. You want to be using a Nagasa Scimitar because it's the highest attack speed base, and then you want to put obviously max roll exalted attack speed, and then if you can get suffixes with like frailty or shred, whatever utility suffixes you can get here is going to be good. Null Portent, obviously just more DR, and then you want to slam the T7 mana generator spell here, and this is just giving you 20% DR, very, very good. Same shield here, dots, big problem in endgame. Even though they're nerfing them, I still think they're annoying, so basically everybody is just getting as much dot mitigation as possible. This shield is a no-brainer. I think it is just crazy, super good shield. Now, one of the supports is going to be wearing Siphon of Anguish here, and the reason for this is because if the supports are wearing Siphon of Anguish ring, then your carries do not have to wear the ring to generate Doom. All they have to do is wear the belt. So if you have supports proccing here, you're saving your carries a ring slot, which is very, very nice. The Doom debuff is 4% more melee damage taken from the mob, and then the belt is giving you 5% more melee damage per stack of Doom. So the carries just have to wear the belt in this case. You on this support are wearing the belt just obviously for the increased armor roll, and then you can get double health rolls, hybrid health, and percent. Other ring is Heirloom of the Last Nomad just for the massive amount of health you can get, and you have to slam 4% block chance here. Immortal Vise is going to be best in slot here for the hit mitigation. If you don't have an Immortal Vise, you can use the blood gloves that they added. It has the same effect here. Grasp of the Blood Mage has the 25% per Genesis effect, and so just getting those with, the Drain mod to enable the healing hands is all you want here. Now, as for the boots, I think Transient Rest is a super good pick here because you're going to have a hard time with your current setup here getting enough suffixes to cap physical, poison, and necrotic res. These boots just solve it perfectly for you, and then obviously you slam movement speed and hybrid health onto them just to increase your personal HP pool. Last but not least is going to be this Solaran Banner. You need extra block chance. It is super hard to get to the block cap with your current affix constraints. You are sitting at 99%. I can't find a way comfortably to get it to 100, so getting this block chance here is the best you can do, getting to 99%. You only need 2 levels of Judgment and 1 levels of Symbols to fit in everything you want, and so you can go with an Exalted Health affix here and getting some poison res, whatever else you need to round out your build here on the Relic. Idols are going to be the same, healing effectiveness, block effectiveness, you have less damage over time. I think it's the best mod to enchant on these. And so yeah, those are both of the support builds that we're running. The reason we're running 2 Paladins is mainly for the defenses. I think there are some builds in the game where the damage can get out of control, and after they have removed Volatile Reversal, you're kind of forced into playing more defensive supports with a little bit of extra supplemental damage, and playing builds that are super high damage and don't really need to benefit from damage from supports, but they can crutch on the ward and everything that the supports are giving. Those are kind of the builds that are going to benefit the most from having support
supports in the party. So the 2 supports, once again, are just going to be a hard caster healing hands Paladin here, and then we have a Judgement guy who's focusing on, attack speed and cleansing. Those are the 2 main things that we're going for here. As a result of this, because we have a lot of life-based healing, builds with high life are going to be very appealing to us, or builds that can basically go hybrid. Those are the builds that are going to benefit the most from the supports that are giving all this defensive utility. I have pondered a lot on a lot of the builds that we're going to be playing in multiplayer, and we've settled on 3 builds that you guys can play in multiplayer. First up is going to be Erasing Strike on Void Knight. You have probably seen a lot of people, Maxwell included, are just super shilling for Erasing Strike Void Knight, and they're right. This build is just absolutely crazy. It was already a very good build on the 1.1 patch, and it only got basically like double damage added to it on the new patch, which is just kind of crazy. The skill was already good. Now, this build is mainly for solo players on the Maxwell website, and there are a few adjustments and, things we do different to the passive tree, because we do have supports that are giving us things like sigils, because we don't need stuff like that on our bar. So carry build number 1 is Erasing Strike. Now, there are 2 different builds I'm going to put out for this. One of them is more of a mapping monolith focus, which has a lot more movement speed built into it and a lot more clear. And the other one is going to be specifically built for Aberoth, where it has a lot more dot mitigation and it has a little bit more survivability built into it. All right, so Erasing Strike the build, and you might be wondering what makes Erasing Strike so OP, and it just all has to do with the numbers and the scaling behind it. One of the things that Erasing Strike has going for it is it starts with an added damage effectiveness of 600%, which is kind of crazy. Erasing Strike, if you don't know what it does, just a slam skill. You press the button and it does a slam. It has a cooldown by default, which you can remove by taking this node over here. The cooldown node is actually gated behind another node, which gives you an additional echo, but it gives you a very, very high mana cost of plus 60 to the skill. So essentially the skill is very, very mana hungry. So the reason to play Erasing Strike is because of all the access to more multipliers on the tree. We start out with 10% more damage here. We have a 40% more damage multiplier here, 50% more damage to slowed enemies here. Additional echoes count as a more multiplier because it attacks more than once if you have the mana to do so. This is essentially like a 200% more multiplier here because you're attacking twice for each attack. Have a 100% more multiplier here and a 50% more multiplier here, which is doubled with a 2-hander, so 100% more multiplier here. The skill has 9 base crit on it, which makes it super trivial to crit cap, especially with the new nodes in the passive tree. And then additionally, we have to take this node at the end to give us Void Essences, which is our primary mana generator. We can quickly go over the rest of the more multipliers just to see how silly it is, and then we can go over how we solve mana on the build. So starting off with Anomaly, there is a 50% more damage taken node here, which is a 50% more damage multiplier on the mob. Void Cleave procs Abyssal Echoes, which gives you 80% more multiplier to slowed enemies here. Additionally, it has a 20% more multiplier versus blinded enemies and gives you a nice attack speed buff. This is all procced with the Void Cleave, of course. And then last but not least, you have Devouring Orb on here for the more global void damage here. And then Devouring Orb is your main source of Void Res Shred here. And those are all of the main multipliers that are on your skills. Now, there's a couple other things that these skills are doing in terms of utility. As I mentioned before, this is a good source of shred on the Abyssal Echoes, and as well as a good attack speed buff here for proccing it. You proc this every single time you cast Void Cleave, and you can Void Cleave on the mobs to add shred as well as normal armor shred. Procs your Abyssal Echoes, procs this buff, procs the 80% more damage, which you hit with your Erasing Strike, and when you echo 2 times, it snapshots all of those buffs onto those additional repeats, so it's a ton of damage. Now, with a skill that costs 60 mana to repeat each time twice, you're going to need a pretty hefty mana pool. Now, you have to get something like 1100 mana to make the build feel good with 1 repeat, but you can do a little bit of additional investment in mana because getting the second repeat is actually a pretty big DPS increase. In party, you don't have to worry about stuff like armor shred, especially on a slam build, which is normally problematic for a build like this because your supports are going to be doing all of the shredding for you. But the main way you get mana back on this build is, of course, going to be on Void Knight. If you're unfamiliar, these points in Void Knight here consume your Void Essences to give you 30% of your max mana pool back every 3 seconds. So basically, if 30% of your mana pool here can last you 3 seconds, then you basically have infinite mana because every time you'll proc your Void Well here, you're going to be getting 30% of it back. And so stacking max mana is an excellent way to sustain all of the cost on the build. This means early on, you can get stuff like Seed of Echidrazil, very, very obtainable item, slam it with guaranteed mana. This helps your mana pool a ton early. Next, we have Nihilus, has percent mana on the implicit. You slam mana onto it. This item has everything you want, including plus levels, because plus levels translates to more multipliers on the Erasing Strike tree. World Splitter is going to be pretty mandatory here. You can use basically any 1-hander or 2-hander while you're progressing here that just has high damage rolls. There's a ton of options. But as soon as you can get World Splitter, even without 2LP from the Harbinger, you should go and get it early in your Empowered Monolith grind, and then slam flat Void melee damage onto it. If for whatever reason you can get it with 2LP, then slam flat mana on here. Titanheart is up next. 2LP is going to be very doable here. This just gives you increased health, DR, armor, everything that you want on this build, and then you slam +4 Racing Strike with flat mana onto it as well, because we want high mana pool for the Void Essence refund. Now, as for your ring choice here, there's basically a choice between going double Flames of Midnight or Osherion, and I think the best mix of you is going to be getting one Osherion for the DR, as well as one Flames of Midnight for the pen, as well as getting the Evade replaced by Spirit Step. This also activates Swiftness, which gives you an additional 10% movement speed. Shattered Chains is pretty no-brainer here. There's basically no other belt that you can consider because of the giant more multiplier that you get for Doom. And then you're going to see a common thread here, which is going to be a Mortal Vise with the Drain mod. If you don't have a Mortal Vise because, Abroth hasn't been killed yet, you just wear the Blood Gloves as a substitute here, which gives you the 25% hit mitigation instead of 30%. These are a very good substitute just for the hit mitigation from bosses. Now, there are two boot options you can run here. One of them is going to be Dark Stride for mapping, and then I would swap to Solaron Step if you're bossing. But there is a higher damage option in the form of Solaron Step. And then last but not least, Anchor is probably just the best relic here. Has a very, very high increased void damage roll. You can slam mana and health onto it. Also gives you strength, which gives you a ton of more damage to your Racing Strike. Very, very good item here. As for the idols, you're going to want these 1x4s. They are very potent, which has echo damage when a skill is echoed and increased void melee damage. This is a ton of increased damage on a 1x4. There unfortunately is not a great enchant here. I personally would take the extra armor dot mitigation because dots in this game are cancer. And honestly, even after the nerf, it's probably still going to be cancer. So extra dot mitigation here is my choice. One thing to mention here is that these new idols, which is going to be the Weaver idols, are super broken because you can get penetration on the prefix. Penetration is a more multiplier, and this isn't going to be affected by the less effect on bosses that Shred is subject to. You're going to want a mix of mana and health idols here, and then you're going to want Void Pen and, fill out your resistances here if you need to. As for your blessings, you do have a choice here between the increased void damage and crit multi. When both of your supports are fully built out, then you have a max javelin giving you a ton of increased damage. The increased void damage here from the blessing is a little less important, and so you're going to want to take the crit multi here. The rest of the blessings are pretty much not changeable. It's mana, fizz res because you have big resistance issues here, and then armor and all res. Some of the broken stuff on the tree here is obviously going to be the free 10% DR you get on the tree. The Void Knight has 5% base crit here and 10% more damage when you hit a thing with low life. You get 1% crit multi per point spent in Void Knight, and that is 93% crit multi on this build. Your 50% elemental damage taken to Void, which then you have less Void damage taken here, as well as on the node over here for 25% less damage taken to Void. And then on top of the Healing Hands node, you have 35% less damage taken to Void. You get raw 24% penetration here. You also have a global 10% more damage here, as well as 5% DR from slowed enemies. Tons of DR, tons of more damage, tons of crit multi, all the good stuff you want on a tree. The rest of your points are just going to be floating between random increased damage nodes like this one. This one's very nice for the movement speed, of course. And then the CDR is pretty nice for reducing the cooldown on your Devouring Orb, as well as your Anomaly, getting the more damage buff up on Anomaly more frequently. The CDR here is going to feel very nice. These points at the top, the Echo Chance, I believe in the current party setup are the best points because they act as a more multiplier. Getting more % increased damage on the tree is not super valuable because you have a ton of increased damage coming from supports. I believe the best points to dump your points into in party are going to be the points here at the top here, grabbing extra Echo Chance. If you don't want to take the Echo stuff here at the top, you can just dump it into life nodes here in Paladin. It's also a very, very good option here. You can also click these nodes here if you're having resistance struggles here. The elemental res here is very, very nice to crutch on if you need it. And additionally, don't be afraid to put more points in here early for the extra health, void, physical res. These points are very, very nice for fixing your build on a budget. All right, so that's all about carry build number 1. That's going to be a Racing Strike. Now, carry number 2 is going to be a Shatter Strike Spellblade. Now, if you've never played Shatter Strike before, it is a melee swipe here that does this, and you can hold it down and you do this. This is a very mana-hungry skill. As you can see here, as I hold the button down, my mana is just getting dumpstered, and so this is also another generator spender skill, and you have to take advantage of spell queuing, as I mentioned earlier, which means that you put Shatter Strike to the left of your generator, which is Mana Strike in this case. So the questions are, why play Shatter Strike? Now, Shatter Strike is a build that can push, into like the 100 million DPS category, probably like 150, maybe even 200 million with really min-maxed gear. There is, however, one big problem with this build, in that it is kind of paper, and there isn't great ways to make it as tanky as you can a Paladin. However, the progression on this character Flamethrower early on is fantastic and almost unbeatable, unrivaled by any other spec. It also gets to start as a mage, and so you get to take advantage of Glacier early on while leveling, which, you know, Glacier is just super broken for leveling. I love it. And then you can transition into a Shatter Strike Spellblade right around the point in which you get a dual wielding node here in the tree, which is a little bit deep in Spellblade, like down here. So you're gonna be like level 40, maybe 45 or something with Glacier, and then you respec the Spellblade. So starting off, Shatter Strike has a ton of more multipliers on the tree that you can take advantage of. So first off, the travel nodes here is 20% more cold damage, moving on to 30% more damage. These points down here, whiteout, give you like a repeat, which is essentially a 100% more multiplier per point, but it adds a ton of mana cost and gives you less attack speed. It's very, very well worth the trade-off because it just makes your attack more mana efficient, especially when you're using a mana generator. If you can make your stuff more mana efficient, it acts as a more multiplier. You get a big attack speed buff down here. These points in the AoE are necessary to grab the nodes over here, which give you crit multi per sword you have equipped, and since you're dual wielding, this is 160 multi, which is kind of crazy. Mana efficiency up here will allow you to attack more, of course, which equals more DPS, since you're limited by how fast you can generate mana on your generator skill. We have 30% more damage here, and then a 40% more damage here, which is doubled against high health enemies, which is 65% or higher. So there's a ton of more multipliers on the tree here, similar to Erasing Strike. These are the things that make last Epoch skills good. It's going to be the access to more multipliers on the tree, and just generically how much scaling you can get on the skill, you know, the damage effectiveness and that kind of thing. Enchant Weapon is just a giant steroid, gives you a ton of flat cold damage here, gives you, you know, increased melee damage down here. This is increased melee damage for missing mana. And so sometimes you'll see people, they'll dump their mana bar with Shatter Strike before a boss starts, and then they'll click Enchant Weapon, you know, after they've dumped all their mana to activate this buff down here. This is also just giving you 50% attack speed, big steroid. Yeah, this is just a click button, do more damage button. It's not super complicated here. Mana Strike is going to be your primary generator. As I said before, you're spell queuing, so you're holding down both buttons. That is Shatter Strike and Mana Strike, and then you're going to be alternating Mana Strike, Shatter Strike, Mana Strike, Shatter Strike. You're going to just take all the generator nodes here. You're taking the mana gain here, taking the mana gain over here, grabbing the mana on crit over here. You're crit capped easily with the stuff in the Spellblade tree, and then you're taking the mana gain on rare or boss hit down here to finish it off. Now, Flame Ward, super obvious here. If you're a mage, you're playing with Flame Ward. It's just your best DR ability in the entire game, but it also acts as a damage steroid because we're taking the 250% increased damage here, as well as converting it to cold with the Frost node over here. You're grabbing the +1 charge, grabbing all the less hit damage here. You can fudge some points and take the less elemental damage over here if you want. Like if you don't want to take the stun node, you can take a little less damage and, you know, fudge the points wherever you want. Last but not least is going to be Flame Reave. Now, while you are mapping, you can tell that Shatter Strike just kind of has some pitiful AoE here. If I put on my bar, like this AoE is just not great. And while you can increase it a little bit, I do think while you're progressing, especially in early monoliths, it's worth putting Flame Reave on your bar just so you have a clear button. So the damage on Flame Reave isn't incredible, but this will really help you inside a monolith, just hitting all of the trash. Now you do have to drop teleport for this, but if you build a decent amount of movement speed on your gear and you're just, you know, crutching on Evade with the Frenzy here, it's gonna feel pretty good, I think. Like you have a good amount of movement speed on this character, right? Now what it looks like with a little bit of AoE investment is you're going to be casting your Mana Strike 3 times. The Rhythm of Fire nodes over here give you 4 stacks per Mana Strike use, and when you have 12 stacks, you consume them to get basically a giant AoE and damage multiplier to your next Flame Reave. So with AoE investment, it looks something like this. It basically is the entire screen, and it'll basically kill any of the trash mobs that are around you. And if you have a rare, you just kind of tap them once with Shatter Strike and they'll die. So when you get to very, very high amounts of attack speed, you can hold down the Mana Strike button and it'll build it extremely fast. And you can then just tap Flame Reave. As long as you have the attack speed, you'll get the rhythm here and you can basically attack with your Flame Reave. It feels super nice on arena echoes while you're stationary, and it just gives you that little bit of extra AoE that you need to clear the trash, which I think is usually pretty annoying on Shatter Strike after playing it for a while. While you're bossing, obviously this is just completely useless, and you should definitely take this off your bar in exchange for teleport. I'll put a version of the planner that is a little bit higher damage and a little bit built more for bossing that has the different skills equipped, and you're basically just dropping Flame Reave for teleport and making some other gear adjustments. As for the rest of the Flame Reave tree though, you want to make it so it returns to you because it'll hit twice. You have a 48% more damage multiplier here. You have the AoE nodes over here, of course, with the Rhythm of Fire stuff going on. Hitting this one pointer here gives you a very consistent frenzy while you're in monoliths. You want to take the increased melee damage here. This Arcane Severance node actually double dips with Sigils of Hope on supports. You can gain flat melee and flat void damage from supports, and then when you gain the spell damage and spell void damage from supports, it will convert that spell damage back to melee damage damage, double dipping on the buffs that the supports are giving you. So this makes your Flame Reave hit pretty hard because of all the flat damage you're giving it. It's something like an extra 100 flat damage or something like that. You can get the base crit pretty high with these nodes here, make the AoE even bigger with these nodes here. A little bit of extra crit multi is nice, and then these more melee damage versus ignited enemies is super nice as well. All right, as for the gearing for this character, some of this stuff is pretty fungible and the other stuff is pretty set in stone. So I tried to make this like pretty tanky with supports. You can make a tankier character, and I think Maxwell has a Shatter Strike version that is even tankier than the one that I put out here, but I try to go for the point where you have enough tankiness to do all the content, but it's as high damage as possible. So this is sitting right under 3k health, and you're going to be getting a ton of ward from all of your idols here, as well as obviously supports channeling healing on you and the Judgement and all of that stuff. So first up is going to be the Barbute. This is just going to be slammed with Dex, and this is going to be your main source of crit mitigation. You don't have full crit reduction on this build, but you just need enough to not, start getting one shot by like some of the boss attacks and like annoying shit in monos. So just a little bit of crit reduction helps here. This is a Morning Frost build, so you're going to see a heavy reliance on dexterity stacking. This build is sitting on 134 dex. The other benefit that Spellblades get from stacking a lot of dex is going to come on the passive tree. They're going to be getting flat crit chance per dexterity as well as base crit chance per intelligence. So stacking a mix of flat crit from int and increased crits from dex is kind of where you want to be. Additionally, all that dex is giving you flat damage, so there's a lot of synergy going on there. Nihilus is just going to be best in slot, slammed with multi here. The +2 is just the best thing because there's big more multipliers on the tree for you to grab, so this amulet, it's irreplaceable if you can get it here. You don't have Nihilus, just throw on some Exalted with crit multi, whatever suffixes you need to res cap until you can go and kill normal Aberoth for Nihilus. Next up, you have Eye of Reen slammed with first melee attack speed and then cold melee damage if you can get it. Eye of Reen has been nerfed to have a 150 crit multi hard cap, but it is still the best offhand for you to put on even after the nerfs. Next up is going to be Scissor of Atropos. If you can get this with melee attack speed and cold melee damage, this is hands down one of the best options to put on. However, if you don't have a really good, 2LP or, Weaver version that rolled well, the next best thing to put on is going to be Null's Tooth. This is going to be a little bit more accessible, 1 in 51 for a 2LP. This gives you the same number of plus skills, has a little bit higher damage, so until you can get a really good well-rolled Scissors, you should be rolling a Null's Tooth instead. Sunwreath is necessary to make your Flame Reave expand in a circle. This saves you a ton of skill points on the tree here that you'd have to path all the way over here for, so while you're in Monoliths, you want to be equipping a Sunwreath. It's super easy to get high LP on this. Even 4 LP is possible on this, but I only put 3 LP on this, so obviously get Dex and whatever resistances you need. Shattered Chains, you're playing a melee build, you equip Shattered Chains, it's as simple as that. You have a ton of attributes on your build, and so Red Ring is a pretty easy thing here. It does help with your res situation. You're going to be super starved for res on a Morning Frost build, so equipping Red Ring here is a pretty no-brainer here. Swaddling, I think if you can get a well-rolled one, is going to be your best choice here. However, Immortal Vise is also a super good option here because it's giving you strength and attack speed, of course. If you need a little bit more hit mitigation, then of course the Blood Gloves here, just simply for the 25% hit mitigation here, is a super good choice as well. So you have a few choices here. Immortal Vise, Swaddling if you can get the attack speed and Dex roll, Cold Res, there's a lot of options here for you. Morning Frost, of course, slam it with movement speed if you're in Monoliths. I think you need a lot of movement speed because you're lacking a mobility skill, and then if you can get like a T5, T6 Dex roll, rolling with Runes of Redemption, Runes of Havoc, this is going to be what you want here. And then last but not least, Bloody Nib. This is going to be the item you want to obtain first as a unique. If you're rolling like, Ascendances in the campaign, rolling for Bloody Nib here is going to be what you want because this gives you cold pen per stack of bleed. Obviously, with an astronomical amount of attack speed here, the amount of Bloody Nib stacks you can get here is going to be, just a huge more multiplier to your damage. Also gives you Dex and multi, and it's just levels. It just has everything you want, right? You're never going to replace this even with Shattered Worlds. Next up is going to be Idols. You can replace the Throne of Ambition if you're on like a mapping setup. Obviously you're not going to have the ramp that you want, but if you're bossing, you're going to have this on. Your idol swap here, if you're not using the Throne of Ambition, is going to be a 2x2 with ward retention, health, and then flat melee and spell damage. As I said before, the 22 spell damage here and melee damage combined gets double dipped on the Flame Reave node, so this helps your Flame Reave damage just a little bit. Rest of the idols here are going to be whatever resistances you need to get capped, but most of them are going to be filled with these exact affixes, which is ward retention, ward per second, and health and mana. This is the best way for this character to get defenses and tankiness, is to stack as many of these idols as you can. They're super potent because of the amount of mana it gives you, also the amount of health you get. They're just super broken. You want these all over. If you feel like you have enough health for whatever reason, you can get cold penetration here, but honestly, you have so much pen from the Bloody Nib, it just feels like kind of a waste. You should really just get as tanky as you can here on all the idols. Blessings here, crit multi, cold damage, resistances, armor, phys res, because you need so much physical res because you have these stupid boots on. If you notice, I'm not even fucking res capped on this build. It's not strictly necessary to get res capped because you can actually get a little bit of res from supports, right? From Holy Aura, that kind of thing. But if you feel like you have to, you can drop a few of these small idols to grab 12% phys res rolls just to fix your last bit of physical resist here. Now, last for the Shatter Strike build, the important stuff to grab on the tree here, you grab a good amount of health and mana here, attack speed, of course, that's what you're stacking. Ward retention, important because you're having a bunch of ward from supports and it's going to be a big chunk of your EHP. Grab nothing in Sork. In Rim Master, you're grabbing the 8% damage reduction here from ignited or shocked enemies. A lot of the stuff you're grabbing in the Spellblade tree is just going to be all the flat damage that you can get. You get 16 here, you get a bunch of melee cold here, you get melee cold here, and then the main stuff here is obviously I mentioned before the crit chance for dex here and the int for crit chance here. And then you're clicking the DR stuff in the middle. This is kind of your only defensive layer that you have. Now for the bossing spec, you swap out your Sunwraith for another red ring. This helps your res situation tremendously here. Basically means you can get cold capped with a support standing next to you with Holy Aura, and so this is the correct amount of res that you want to be at. And you just have to swap one of your idols over for phys res and you can actually get capped. You also want to swap Flame Reave for teleport. This gives you basically a source of haste and it gives you the stun immunity, which is very, very important. Feels very good for bossing. Then obviously having the extra mobility to dodge attacks, yada yada, very good. So that is carry potential number 2, which is going to be Shatter Strike Spellblade. And now the last thing we need to talk about is going to be the potential third carry we might play, which is going to be a ColdCrow Bosskiller. Now, one thing I have to mention about this build, it is heavy abusing on snapshotting. It is taking full advantage of this mechanic to do as much damage as possible. And the clear on this build is non-existent. It only basically functions as a boss killer because it just has a cooldown nuke that just does a ton of damage, which is Crowstorm on summon crows. I'd say this build is unviable to level with, and if you're going to roll this character, it would simply have to be a respec late, you know, when you're in like late 90s, that kind of thing. But here is a quick clip of the build in action. This training dummy dies in about 4 seconds. Keep in mind it has a billion HP and 100k regen, so this build with some pretty min-max gear can do about 250 to around 300 million DPS when it's fully optimized for. As you can see, the Crow Storms, when they're going off cooldown here, is hitting for like 150 million, somewhere in that range. They do like 175 million here for this particular hit. So first thing to understand about ColdCrow bossing is that you need to understand how snapshotting works in Last Epoch and all of the mechanics surrounding it. So first thing you need to know about summoning minions in Last Epoch is that the stats on your character sheet are snapshotted when the minions are summoned. Specifically, any attack speed, cast speed, minion crit multi, minion damage, all of those stats that are on your minion character sheet here are snapshotted to the minion on creation. That means you can put on a bunch of increased minion damage gear and increased minion damage crit multi here, and then simply when you summon the minion and they're summoned, you can take all these gear pieces off afterwards, and they will still have all of those stats snapshotted onto them. You can further abuse this by using stuff like Jolra's Star Dial, where whenever you use a movement or traversal skill, it gives you this buff here, which triples the stats on your rings, giving you a huge bonus to your increased minion damage and life. These rings here at 2LP are very, very obtainable, and you can put a variety of things on here like minion damage and minion life, of course. And then what you can do is you can teleport or roll and then summon all of your crows, and now they are snapshotted with all of those damage mods. The second thing you can do is use a Communion of the Erased, and it has stats on this item are doubled after using a potion, and then of course you get one with minion damage. So I roll, I potion, then summon my crows, and I have the full snapshotting bonus of the belt plus the rings here. One thing you can also do is snapshot all of your idols with a bunch of DPS idols. You can put cold pen as well as cold damage shared on the idols here, summon all of your storm crows, and then unequip all of your idols for a tank set if you want to. There are some restrictions on what you can and can't snapshot though. Anything that is giving you plus levels to your skills of your main hand, if you ever try to change them, will update the stats on your summon crows. So anything that's giving you plus levels is off limits for swapping with snapshotting. So we can compare the two planners here with the snapshotting gear and the tank set here. When you have the tank set on, we go to 4300 life with a ton of DR on the passive tree for free that you get from Primalist and Beastmaster. You also have a ton of boar scaling and that kind of thing. So you can see how you can utilize all the offensive power from snapshotting, you know, with all of the idols as well as the, you know, this gear here. Afterwards, when all this crows are summoned and that kind of thing, you can basically swap to a completely new set of gear, make yourself extremely tanky, and this is what makes this this an excellent boss killer, on top of the fact that this is the single most highest DPS build on the patch. So let's start off with the summon ColdCrow Tree and figure out why this skill does so much damage. And of course, if you know about this game, it is going to be how many more multipliers you have access to. And Stormcrows has access to a ton of more multipliers, which are just crazy. So the main thing here that is doing damage is going to be the Crow Storm ability. The crows themselves, with their stupid little auto attack, actually do like 5% of the total damage here. They're mainly there to proc Shred and Frostbite and that kind of thing. But the ability here that you cast, the Crow Storm, is what is doing 95% of the damage. And so the nodes down here, 120% more damage with Crow Storm. We have Crow Storm AoE, which is just a travel node. And then we have 30% more damage per contributing crow. And we have a total of 6 crows. This is 180% more damage. You also have a 20% more multiplier down here. Have a damage per shock down here, which is converted to Frostbite with the cold node. So this is 90% more damage here. Then you have free crit multi and basically free crit crap down here from the Observe and Learn node. Then going over to the top left, you get some armor shred. This node is 20% damage per crow, 120% damage multiplier. And then down here, you have 60% more damage as well. Tons and tons and tons of more multipliers going on here. The last thing here is Crow Storm has an innate 50% more damage per contributing crow for a total of 300% more damage implicitly on the skill. What's nice about the crows is that the Crow Storm ability doesn't actually have to be anywhere close to you in proximity to the crows to cast the ability. As you can see, my crows are way over here, and I can cast my Crow Storm anywhere I'm putting the cursor. So your crows can be just, off doing nothing and being useless, and you're just using the Crow Storm ability off on your own. Swipe is going to be the next main skill here. You're using Swipe simply to proc Crow Storm here. Whenever you use this ability with the cooldown, it'll proc your Crow Storm, which is 95% of your damage. And so that's what Swipe is doing here. War Cry is just giving you a bunch of crit chance, which you need on your crows. It's hard to get increased crit on your crows, and War Cry is just the best way to get it here. Additionally, it's giving you a big berserk buff, which is giving you a ton of attack speed. The attack speed is important because you're using Swipe to proc your crows, which means you want the Swipe to be a quick animation. And then additionally, the Tempest Strike is going to be buffing your birds with the Gladiator of Lagan buff. This is doubled if you have 50 intelligence, which you can reach by doing a gear swap. So you don't actually have to have the 50 intelligence on your initial snapshot. All you have to do is have 50 intelligence on your post swap gear to double the effect of all the flat damage of the Gladiator of Lagan. You then make this skill free by removing all of the Tempest, and you get a ton of attack speed on these nodes here as well. So with all of those nodes, your attack speed is fairly quick, and you will be able to ramp this buff to around, maybe 15 to 18 stacks. Sometimes it'll dip down. You're not going to have 100% uptime on this buff on bosses. The important thing also here is to utilize spell queuing with Swipe, where we're holding down Tempest Strike and casting Swipe whenever it is off cooldown, because we want it to cast, as a priority spell. So you spell queue Tempest Strike and Swipe by holding them both down and putting Swipe left of the Tempest Strike here. You also want to spell queue War Cry here so that you'll cast it whenever you're off cooldown. And then the last thing on your bar is Summon Wolf, just to give you an extra companion. This acts as a 1.72 damage multiplier to your Crow Storm. It is simply just the best thing to have on your bar. There is some other options. We messed around with Summon Frenzy Totem here, where this gives you a cooldown reset on your companions, but the amount of time you're casting, that makes it so you have to have a very perfect rotation in order to deal more damage. However, the Summon Wolf is slightly lower damage, but has a much better playstyle because it's more consistent damage. However, if you have a perfect rotation on a dummy, getting the double reset on the Frenzy Totem is more damage. As for the Snapshotting gear itself, you obviously want to get a plus levels on everything because of the access to all the more multipliers on the tree. This is the main reason why cold conversion is better than lightning on this build, is because you have access to Apogees of Light, which is giving you +3 on each, and you dual wield them for a total of +6, which is massive. Additionally, this damage per shock node down here is impossible to cap with shock. However, when you take the cold conversion node, it makes this scale off of Frostbite instead, and this is making it so that you can deal 90% more damage instead of 60% more damage when you convert it to cold. You're going to want to slam Cold Pen as well as minion spell damage on both of your Apogees of Light, and then the more damage roll is the only other thing you really care about here. The cold melee damage doesn't really do anything here, of course. As for the helmet, we're using +2 on the Artor's Legacy. This gives you 1 max companion, which is obviously big damage multiplier. Plus levels, this is everything we want. We're slamming minion crit multi multi and, you know, just shared minion damage here. We're trying to get the most amount of increased damage onto our crows as possible. Death Rattle is a good snapshotting item because you get crit multi, crit chance, of course. You put minion damage, minion health because you don't want your crows to fall over. Chest piece is new, Mantle of the Pale Ox. This is giving you, you know, +2 to your minions. More levels, more damage, of course. 16 strength is giving you ink damage on your crows. It's also giving you some armor scaling for yourself, which is very nice. Giving you increased health. We're slamming +4 crows with increased minion damage and crit multi onto it. This item is just, you know, best in slot for snapshotting minions now. As for the rings, you want to get minion damage, minion health, 2 LP on these rings. This is going to be your strongest snapshotting item because once again, these affixes are tripled. So you can get 720% damage between your 2 rings on your star dials and something like, you know, 1200% health on your minions between the 2 star dials when you teleport. For Minion of the Erase, the only mod you care about here is increased minion damage because once again, you're going to be taking it off as soon as you know, do all your snapshotting. Dora's Obsession, you want to snapshot these and then take them off, of course. You just want minion damage here. We put Void Res as the second affix here because if you're taking these into Aberoth, Aberoth does a bunch of void damage, and so you want to make them as tanky as you can to all of the dots and stuff that are in the arena, you know, the void pools, the stupid beams and stuff, and so capping your crow's Void Res, you know, does a lot for their survivability here. Foot of the Mountain is just giving you a ton of attributes, which is translating to increased damage on the Crow Storm scaling, that kind of thing, and then also the T7 mod, which is the Traversal mod, is the best increased damage mod you could slam on here. You're going to be taking these off anyway, so this is just another snapshotting item. Dedication of the Erase Primalist is primarily used here for the +1 skills. Now, if you're using +1 here, of course, you cannot take it off. The new Shattered Worlds relic here is probably going to be better, but, you know, while you don't have that, you're using this with +1, and then you're going to want to slam attunement and or health onto it with the Weavers. All of your idols here is just penetration and shared damage. You want as many of these as you can. It gives you a total of like 72 penetration, and then once again, you're taking these all off for snapshot. Now, as we look to the tank set, we can take off all of the items that aren't giving us plus levels here. So we're swapping the Amulet to Orion's Eye, mainly because it's an Oracle base. Less damage over time taken base is super nice. The void damage taken as fire is super nice when we take less fire damage because, once again, Aberoth does a lot of void damage here. The helmet, the chest, and the swords all can't change. The rings we're going to be using, Heirloom of the Last Nomad. This is a super nice way to, 1, cap your resistances, and 2, give you a very, very high HP pool. You have a good amount of damage reduction from the passive tree on Primalist as well, so you don't really need to be building DR in the form of red rings. The raw HP pool that these provide you is going to be more EHP in the long run here. As for the belt, this new belt gives you 25 intelligence. We can slam CDR onto it as the best affix here because, 1, all of our DPS is on a cooldown, and so reducing the cooldown of swipe as well as the summon Crowstorm is just a big DPS boost. We also go for T6 or T5 hybrid health if you can't Havoc craft the Immortal Vise. Of course, with the Drain mod, it's going to be on all of the characters. This is just best in slot here. If you don't have Immortal Vise, you can of course use the Blood Mage gloves as a substitute for the hit mitigation that these gloves provide, or even perhaps Ravenous Void. Blood of the Exile is simply used here for the ton of attributes that you can get here. It helps once again with the intelligence that you need to hit the Lagan buff. It also has a hefty amount of movement speed on this build, so, you know, you can dodge attacks, that kind of thing. Yeah, super nice pair of boots here. And then as for the idol swap, one thing you need to get here is a bees per 10 seconds idol. The bees per 10 seconds when they're summoned don't have all of the snapshotting gear equipped when they're summoned, so that means they have a very high likelihood of dying, which means that you're going to be able to proc the Frozen Vengeance buff. The Frozen Vengeance buff gives you another more damage multiplier, which is 24% more. The 24% Frozen Vengeance damage buff does not stack, but the 24% more cold damage to necrotic and shield enemies does, and this idol lets you proc it when your bees die. As for the rest of the idols, you want to use them to res cap and get as much health as possible here. 9% health on these big idols, and then you can get your crit mitigation and armor here as well. This also gives you some good Ellie res, good health. These are just, you know, idols you need to fix your resistances here. So this build's going to be sitting at like 4.3k life here. Top end, you're going to be getting a bunch of ward from supports, and you have a ton of DR from the Immortal Vise / Blood Mage gloves. You have a bunch of aspect of the boar scaling on the tree, of course. Not to mention you have minions with 100k life with the damage redirected to minions on the chest piece. So you have a ton of DR layers on this build as well. Passive tree is mostly uninteresting. You have the dual wield node, of course, because you have 2 swords. You're just taking a bunch of attunement where you can and a bunch of increased damage for your minions, and then some personal survivability in the Beastmaster tree in the form of boar scaling as well. You want to take all of the boar nodes here. You also get a hefty amount of crit multi from the Lynx nodes here further in the tree. Once you get the build going, you simply have to do a dodge roll, teleport, summon your crows, and then you spell queue all your spells, and you can just see how much it pumps on the dummy. It is just ridiculous how much damage this build does. So that's all of the carry builds that we're going to be potentially playing in the 1.2 patch. Now, the current plan is to roll an Erasing Strike character and a Shatter Strike character and the 2 supports that we mentioned, and then later on we're going to be respecking the Shatter Strike guy into a Bosskiller with all of the Snapshotting gear later on. The reason for that is Shatter Strike has a pretty hard problem getting super tanky later on in the game, and we want to just have a consistent Bosskiller, so the Erasing Strike guy is probably going to be boosting another character maybe on like day 2 or day 3 or something, so we can reroll and, you know, go and attempt Uber Aberoth and that sort of thing. If I had to like draw you a shitty MS Paint graph, okay, it's kind of like this. If I had to gauge the relative power of these builds versus like what level you are, or, you know, the content that you're doing, Shatter Strike would be here at the top. It is just phenomenal. It is just exceptional at doing all of the progression. The only downside is it just doesn't have great avenues to make it tanky towards the end, and so it kind of just falls off towards the end, right? The line here in the middle, orange, is going to be, you know, your Erasing Strike here. It's like okay early. It's like does decent damage. It's not the greatest. And then, you know, when you hit that mana threshold where you're able to just get as much mana to cast Erasing Strike as you want, it kind of just like blasts off, and it's just super powerful in the end game. It's an excellent mapper, tons of movement speed. It's just all around one of the best builds, and very, very, you know, uber capable in my opinion. And then the last one is going to be the Stormcrows. This build is just dog shit. It doesn't do anything, so you kind of like need to get it boosted. So it's honestly, it's like below 0. Like this shit is just garbage. And when you get all the Snapshot gear, you get all the gear together, and you want to go do bosses, it just fucking like blasts off into the stratosphere, right? Like it just does so much damage. It's the highest damage build of the patch. I don't think I'm going to see anything do more damage than that thing, but yeah, maybe we'll see some crazy stuff with the new items. Hopefully there's no bugs or anything like that, right? That goes over most of the endgame planners. I'm going to be doing a separate video going over like all of the progression and leveling, because there's a lot of things you can do to progress these builds. And so I'm going to put that into a separate video on like how you want to progress your characters, what your Weaver tree wants to look like, all of that sort of thing. I'll try to get that out tomorrow. I have a few more things to do this evening. So yeah, if you have any questions, you can leave in the comments. I'll be happy to answer any questions you guys might have. And once again, I'm Snap, and thanks for watching.